Hello and welcome. My name is Sam Young. I'm the Senior Director of Legacy and Plan Giving at Compassion and Choices. Welcome to our exclusive Legacy webinar where we will cover various topics surrounding end-of-life planning. It is our objective to provide you with sound information that allows you to create the legacy you desire. Compassion and Choices is the largest and oldest 501c3 nonprofit organization with a mission to improve care, expand options, and empower everyone to chart their end-of-life journey. We envision a society that affirms life and accepts the inevitability of death, embraces expanded options for compassionate dying, and empowers everyone to choose end-of-life care that reflects their values, priorities, and beliefs. Compassion and Choices has 450,000 supporters and is active in all 50 states, Washington, D.C., Guam, and Puerto Rico. We are honored today to have Kimberley Pittman-Schulz, who focuses on grief and life transitions and is also a noted mentor, coach, and author. Kimberly helps people struggling with grief to reimagine life after the loss of someone they love. She brings a unique perspective to her work. After investing 20 plus years in the philanthropic sector, showing people how to do meaningful end-of-life planning, she shifted focus during the pandemic to working with individuals and small groups, supporting them on their journey with grief. Experiencing her first loss as a child, followed later in life with multiple losses resulting in prolonged grief, she created her own process for finding her way back into life of joy and well-being. Through her book, Grieving Us, a field guide for living with loss without losing yourself, a #1 new release on Amazon upon publication, she's sharing her process with thousands around the world. She is also deeply committed to CNC as a legacy donor. Let's begin our special dialogue, and please feel free to share your questions and personal experiences with us. And before I get into this, I just recently had a personal loss of my mother, and I just want to say that Kimberly has been comforting through her information, support, and I hope you will embrace her to do the same. So jumping right in, Kimberly, can you share your personal story and experience with loss and grief with us?
First of all, I want to say thank you, Sam, for that lovely introduction. And I want to say hello to all of the wonderful Compassion and Choices supporters, friends, advocates, storytellers. This is a special organization to me, and it's really my honor to be here with you. So, we all experience loss. I'm not going to say that I'm more special than anybody else. Part of life is experiencing losses. In my case, my first losses started when I was just 3.5. We had a house fire, and I won't go into all the details other than to say that I was in a room with my 2 other sisters. I had an older sister in the bunk above me and a little sister in a crib near the door. And I was the only one to be able to get out of that room before our house took fire. So right from the early start, I had experienced significant loss. It was devastating for my parents. My mother never really got over it, ever, ever, ever. She didn't have a lot of support that she probably could have used. And I didn't actually have anyone to talk to about grieving and loss. So as a kid, I had to figure out a lot of stuff on on my own. Then fast forward, of course, again, more losses came along. And about 2 weeks before my mother died, and I was, I guess I was quite a bit farther along in life, obviously, at that point. I was an adult. And about 2 weeks before my mother died from small cell lung cancer, my friend and next door neighbor died by suicide. And so those 2 losses together were really a double whammy and sent me into that prolonged grief in a way that I never would have expected. So I had many people at the time tell me, oh, maybe you should look at antidepressants. And antidepressants, sometimes grief does go into depression. Definitely, it does sometimes. But I knew in my bones that grief and depression are actually different. And there are no timelines for grief. But I also knew I didn't want to stay in this really dark place where I felt like the world was going on without me. When you lose people that you love deeply, you lose a part of your identity. I mean, there really is a loss because who we are is connected to the people that we love and care about. So I went through a period of almost 2 years before I finally kind of very accidentally found the first step toward getting my life back, and being able to be happy, be joyful. And, now part of my mission is, you can't make grief go away quickly, but we don't have to get stuck there. And we can certainly shorten the amount of time that we spend suffering. So, and I'm here to say, right now I have a husband who's in his end of life time. So I'm in that caregiver role as well. And that brings another kind of grief, right? So we're all on that journey. And what I hope is that by being supportive of others and helping others find their path forward, we can get to joy a lot sooner than we often think we can.
You would think I could navigate Zoom by now, Kimberly. Thank you for sharing. And
Technology, still technology. Yes. No worries.
it's really wonderful. And I'd like to follow up with that question and ask you, what are the best ways to work through grief?
Well, there are many ways. There are many, many ways to work through grief. As a matter of fact, in 2000, at the early start of the pandemic, when I very first started thinking about writing a book related to grief, because I had, at that point, I was working in philanthropy. So I had donors I had worked with many years ago, as well as current donors reaching out, especially older donors who were very concerned about dying alone. If you remember early in that pandemic period, there were a lot of people that, it might not have even been COVID. They may have had heart disease, cancer, all the other diseases that we live and die with, right? Who could not have their loved ones with them. And so I felt at the time, the only thing worse than socially distanced living was socially distanced dying. And it brought death, I think, really into mainstream America and really into the world. We were experiencing this, it's what I call a communal grief. I mean, we were experiencing a sense of loss, whether it's not even loss of life, but actually, loss of freedom, loss of being able to see all of someone's face, right? The loss of being able to just go someplace and do the things that we want to do. So when I was thinking about writing a book, my first question was, do we need another book about grief? Because there are a lot out there. But in doing a little research, literally reading books myself, as well as looking at some of the comments from readers about what was working and what they didn't have, I was able to say, no, I do have something to offer to the conversation. So the short answer to your question is there's many ways to navigate grief. But what I found through my own process, and of course now as I work with people grieving the loss of someone they love or special animals, I work with people. It's hard to believe for some, but if you have an animal that's very, very close to you, for some people, I've worked with people that losing an animal is even harder than losing a person, because that animal, one of the things that makes loss so difficult is, again, people are part of who we are. They become part of our daily routines. And so when someone or a special animal dies, we literally have a broken space, or many broken spaces in our days and in our weeks. So what I found in working with individuals is that there are really sort of 4 grief pathways that we tend to work through, and we work through all of them. But what I find is the place where sometimes people feel really stuck, like they just can't get past the suffering, they just can't seem to get back into life, or they've lost their energy for living. Very often that stuck place is exactly the pathway that they need to emphasize in order to move forward. So to give you an example, I'm an animal person and a nature-oriented person, so I put the grief pathways in my own head from the standpoint of the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, water. So to give you an example of one pathway, I think everyone would agree that one of the hardest, if not the hardest things about losing someone you love is just missing them. You just miss their physical presence. You can hold them in your heart and your spirit. You can surround yourself with things that represent them, but they're not physically there, right? So often people are told, move on, leave the person behind. There was a point in time where psychology said it's better not to think about it, just move forward. But so much of that has changed. I've had people who have approached me about being a client ask, is it weird that I still talk to my mother after she's gone? Is it weird that I feel my husband's presence even though he's gone? And I say, no, not weird. It's actually now considered quite healing. And the data and human history shows that when we can find a way to keep our loved ones in our life in new ways, and again, there are multiple ways of doing that, it actually helps us move through our grieving a little bit more quickly and to find joy in the midst of our grief by learning how to hold on to the people and the animals that we love. So I call that the air process. There's another fundamental process that I call the earth pathway, and that's really around sensory healing. And if we have time today, I have a wonderful practice. It's the practice that ultimately helped me find my way back after the death of my mother and my friend and neighbor to suicide, that I call Tiny Come Back to Your Senses ritual. And it's based on sensory healing. We forget about our ability to ground ourselves in the present moment, simply using our own senses, and it allows us to take a break from grief. So there are different pathways, but what I really try to focus on is, where are people stuck and how can they do something? You do have to take some action in moving through grief and finding your way back into life. I often hear people say, time heals all. Well, not really. Time is not an antidote for grief. It does get better because our memories and our experiences soften with time. But we do need to take an active role in healing our lives and learning how to use grief as it's meant to be used, as a process for integrating loss and continuing to live our heartbroken and still beautiful and meaningful life that we're meant to live. So there's multiple ways, but there's definitely at least 4 grief pathways that become really important when people are trying to find their way back. Or it's not even back, right? Because the life we knew is gone. It's creating that whatever's next in our life so that we can learn to be happy, joyful, feel a sense of well-being and purpose.
That's beautiful. And I have read it and reread it. Kimberly's book really outlines this further. We could speak the rest of the day. Kimberly, there was one question, and I'm gonna pose the question and then also bring you to the next question, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So had a question is, do you have any experience applying the 12-step programs to the grieving process? And if so, have you incorporated that into your counseling? But what I want to go on, so I don't have to interrupt, is how do people invite joy into their lives during the period of grief, as a follow-up question to that specific question?
So I want to make sure I understand that first question. It's relating to the 12-step program, as in 12 steps related to moving through a substance dependency. Are we talking about that type of 12-step program?
I'm going to say, for purposes of this, without further, I think it's a reference to those type of programs, and whether it has any space in your process, and then to move on to inviting joy into grief.
Yeah, I haven't directly worked with individuals utilizing the 12-step process as part of the grieving process. I certainly have worked with people in recovery who have been moving through, and in some ways there's often a process that's put out there that this organization, Compassion and Choices, is very well aware of, which talks about the stages of grief, and that often gets misunderstood as well, because there's this feeling that you have to go through the certain stages of grieving in order to feel better. And first of all, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who initially made that observation about grieving, it was applied to people who had terminal illnesses and were facing their own death. And then it's since been applied. And I can tell you, when I'm in the deepest places of grief, Sam, I can go through all those stages in like a half an hour. And then the 12-step program, I think, for those in recovery from whether it's alcohol or some other substance abuse, or, sometimes it's behavioral aspects that they're trying to deal with. In some ways, there's some similarities in that there is a process there. Sometimes there's certain steps where we get stuck. And so sometimes in the process of working with people, we'll identify where they're stuck and figure out how do we, focus forward. So if there's a follow-up question to that, I'm certainly happy to answer that. But I don't utilize 12 steps per se as part of my practice.
And I appreciate that for perspective. And also at the end, we're going to provide some information where perhaps it's a dialogue in what you do. But let me bring it back to the question: how do you invite joy into people's lives during grief? And it seems like there's ongoing grief just related to the COVID-19 pandemic. I think you alluded to it earlier. Do you find that to be true? And do you find that people you mentioned, not seeing a face and things like that. So you've answered part of it, but let's focus on inviting joy in and your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I often hear when I work with individuals, and when before I moved into doing this work full time, this grief and helping people rebuild their lives after loss, as a mentor and coach. As you know, Sam, I worked in philanthropy for 20 plus years, and what I realize is so many people who are motivated to give, it often comes out of a place of loss. It's a way of helping them find meaning and purpose after some sort of loss. So, what I found in those conversations over many years, as well as in my conversations, whether it's part of my small group program that I offer or my one-to-one, is people often feel like they have to go through grief to get to joy. It's like grief is some long hallway that you have to go through to get to another room. And what I've discovered, and I discovered, when I was coming out of that grief around my mother and my friend's suicide, is that grief coexists with joy. Grief can be powerful. Grief is actually a kaleidoscope of emotions. It's not just sadness. It can be anger. It can be abandonment. It can be shame or regret. There's a lot of emotions that come into that grief and grieving process. But what I discovered is, just below the surface of that grief, joy is there. It's waiting. It can be really hard. And anyone who's grieving right now knows just how hard it can be. You can feel like joy will never happen again. For some, joy, and we didn't define the word joy, which, that's an important thing, because sometimes people may think I mean we're going to dance on the roof. That's not what I mean. Joy is this inner feeling that you're going to be okay, that life is still beautiful, that your life has meaning and purpose and value. I tell my clients all the time, you bring to this world something that only you can give. And, you don't want that to be lost in grief, So one of the way that I discovered on my own that grief is right there in the midst of joy, that I didn't have to wait till I was done grieving to feel good again, but that I could find that I could actually take a break from grief. That's really how I thought of it. It started by, at that point, I was living in a different place near a river, and I had been, like I said, 2 years in this deep state of grief. And every night before I went to bed, I would lock all the doors. And one night I decided to walk out to the river because we had this lovely river frontage in Southwest Washington. And I just stood there for a moment and I just listened. I listened to the flow of the river. At one point, I thought I heard voices upriver, and I realized that was just the sound of the water as it shifted and flowed and ebbed through the rocks and along the banks. I could hear birds shuffling, in their nighttime roosts. And I just stood there. I could feel the moisture on my skin. And then I turned and I was heading back to the house when I realized, oh my gosh, in that moment where I was just in the moment of being by the river, I was okay. I wasn't sad. I wasn't regretful. I was actually okay. And when you're really, really grieving, feeling okay feels really good. So that became the part of what really the starting point for what I call a tiny come back to your senses ritual, and using your senses, initially just one sense, right? To help bring you back into your body, back into the moment, and literally create a little break from grief. Because once you create that break, that creates space for feeling okay, feeling well, feeling hopeful, feeling joy. So like I said, there are many ways to do that, but I just find this one simple ritual, and I've taught it to many people. And you start with just 3 minutes, because when you're really grieving, you might feel like, I can't take on any more, Kimberly. Don't tell me I have to do one more thing. I can't get off the couch right now. I'm so sad. But almost everybody has 2 or 3 minutes that they could spend and just be with their own senses. So that's certainly one way. But the most important thing, Sam, because I'm here to serve, is I just want people to know that grief is not forever. Some people may struggle with grief for a very long time. Grief is really tidal, like the ocean. It comes and goes. And when you first have a loss, it feels like tidal waves that are drowning you. And as you work through your grief and begin to make progress, the waves will get smaller. You'll have these periods when you're not feeling so caught up in sadness or despair or aloneness. And then again, with some effort, you can begin to rebuild your life on top of that. But it's important for people to know that it's not always and forever, even though it can seem that way. And it is possible. So often we'll laugh and feel like, oh my gosh, how could I laugh when this one that I love is gone? But that's part of grief too. that's actually part of grief too, because your body needs that release, your spirit, your emotions, your mind needs that release. So that's the most important thing I can share, is that joy and grief coexist, and it's just finding your pathway to tap back into it. And I just, for me personally, tapping into sensory healing is a good way to do that.
That is really wonderful. And, sometimes the answer is right in front of us, but you need to hear it and embrace it. I love your example of just going by the river or water. To me is very healing. I have some other questions. I'm going to go to one more question that I have, and then if it's
Sure.
okay, I have some interesting questions for you to do.
Awesome.
But I'd just like to bring this together. And how does giving lead to handle healing, excuse me, and what's the intersection between grief and giving, as a general concept? And then I'll get into some of the other questions that have come up in the Q&A.
Definitely part of my process is giving. I mean, when I was working full time in philanthropy and one-to-one with donors, and I mean from every walk of life, I worked with ranchers in Montana and people living in New York City, and retired school teachers and active moms and engineers, so many different people. And for me, what I realized that, first of all, the fact that I was drawn into that work, and I didn't realize this until literally I was working on the book in 2000, that I realized that part of my life path was in fact driven by loss. It was, one of the things I talk about with clients and in the book is, sometimes one of the ways that we can keep our people with us after they're gone is by being what I call an avatar. It's sort of, there were days where I felt like if I couldn't get off the couch or go for a walk, for me, maybe my beloved other, maybe I can go and use my eyes and let them see what's happening in the world. And, there are limits to this. We can overdo this, right? But, what I realize is that giving is one way that we lift ourselves out of grief. And I encourage people that I work with to actually create a giving ritual. And it can be really small. It can simply be, what I'll say is, take your random act of kindness and just be less random about it. Be a little more intentional, because big part of healing is, having attention and then expressing intention. So where that intersection comes for me is that when I've talked in the past with donors, and today as I work with clients, and I kind of try to understand their story, what's it about, what's motivating them, where are they stuck, where are they looking for purpose and meaning, and I've had people say, why should I think about giving? Why should I care about others when I'm suffering? So, people should be helping me. But when we lift ourselves up and we start looking around us and we realize, and the pandemic did a really good job of this, when we look around and we realize, I'm not the only one suffering, and we can support each other. So giving doesn't necessarily mean giving money, although that's great, right? But at the same time, there's ways that we can give of ourselves. We do bring this world something only we can give, and simply listening, simply listening. So giving, the nexus there is that by giving, it allows us to rise, sort of transcend our grief for a while. It allows us, it's kind of like dipping your head up out of a hole and looking around. When I have a teaching slide that I've used before, and it kind of shows a meerkat coming up out of its hole and standing on its hunches and looking around. That's kind of what the giving does, is it gets you out of your little grief hole for a while to look around. And then as you help others, the big secret to giving that I've always known is you feel good when you give. You just feel good when you've helped others. And it can be simple as listening, just listening. And often I think whatever it is you feel you need, give that to someone else. So if you need someone to really listen to you, take a moment to listen to someone else, and you're going to feel better. So that's really, so the nexus for me, and it is what has led a lot of people to, whether it's, monetary giving, or whether it's volunteering or being an advocate, or just simply showing up at your kid's school to teach something, is a really great way to help people take a break from grief for a while.
That is really wonderful. We have a lot of questions, Kimberly, so I'm
All
going to
right,
just go through them and
let's
just
jump
ask
in.
some general things, and we can certainly have some follow-up from this. The
Sounds great.
first one is, how do you transition from anticipatory grief to the final grief process, like losing a loved one to dementia?
So transitioning from anticipatory, then actually losing someone, and we've got dementia in the mix. The person you're losing has dementia.
Yes.
Well, it's interesting. For one, I mean, on one hand, the anticipatory grief in some ways prepares you, right? When my mother was passing, we knew she probably had 6 to 9 months. So you're in that with my husband right now, there's definitely that anticipatory piece that I know someday he will not physically be with me. But, so you have to tend to that. You do need to tend to it when you're going through it and acknowledge it. It's a real thing. And like all grief, it's not just sadness. It can be anger. It can be, confusion. It can be anxiety. It can be, I should have, I would have, I wish I could have, it's all these things. What happens when you cross that threshold and you lose that beloved other? Sometimes people feel like, oh, well, I've done all this grieving. So, and what's really hard for people that have been in a caregiving situation for a period of time, and the person that you're caring for due to the disease can change them. I mean, literally go through personality changes, become people that we love and look like the people that we love, but aren't kind of quite the same person. That's another kind of grief in and of itself. So when you get on the other side, sometimes we think, it's, once I get past this, I'm ready for it. I know it's coming. I'm not going to have a deep grief. And sometimes that is true. Sometimes there's all kinds of grief that you have held on to that you knew was coming and you couldn't let yourself really feel it. And so you just really have to let go at the end. So it really does depend on the person and what the circumstance is. And I think the other thing that comes with when being a caregiver in that, or surrounding someone, trying to be there for someone at end of life, is a lot of regret about yourself and a lot of guilt about moments. The best person in the world loses their temper sometimes. It's hard when you're trying to protect someone and they do something and you just couldn't prevent that. You couldn't prevent that and you blame yourself. Or sometimes you lose your cool, and that can be really hard. So part of that grief is not only the grief over losing the person, but you've lost that relationship, right? You've transitioned into, maybe a caregiver role, or it's not the same relationship because you're kind of two different people now. And then there's a whole new personality that you adapt, whether you're the daughter caring for the dying father. Who are you when your father is no longer on the planet? You're a daughter, but so there's all these other kinds of losses of roles. There's the loss in your daily life. You go from all this caregiving to suddenly these huge swaths of time that are open that can become absolute grief holes. And so identifying those places in your day where you fall into, serious grief is important, because you want to begin to create some activities, some energy, some practices and rituals that help you essentially create a bridge through those difficult spaces to the other side. But for anyone that thinks, oh, I've had anticipatory grief, it's not going to be so bad on the other side. It depends on the person and the circumstance. It could be better, it could be worse. And then the other thing that you're often dealing with is a sense of relief sometimes. You don't want to lose your person. You really don't. And yet, if you, watch someone go through some very, very difficult physical changes, there is that relief, and then you feel guilty about that. I do encourage anyone going through it to try to find a few people to support you through it, and don't try to do it all on your own. To have someone you can talk to about this.
It's really good. And it kind of gets to the next question, which one is very personal to me. And just really funny about labels. Someone said to me, now that you've lost a second parent, you're an orphan. And that just hit me in a very weird way to think like that. So I appreciate the perspective that you're giving us of not only solution oriented, but ways to frame things. And the next question, Kimberly, is any thoughts or ideas on how to deal with complicated grief when there are very difficult or negative relationship with the deceased or serious unfinished business? And I must say that everyone is really, the questions are very specific and well put out there. So I want to say thank you to the audience for that, and want to ask you for your thoughts on that. Difficult relationships, business.
Yeah, this is a significant one. And first of all, I want to say to those of you asking these questions, for the most part, I've heard them before. And what that means is, and I want you to know, you're not the only one having these experiences. That's not to downplay your experience, but to help you know you're not alone. And I think that's really important, because when you're going through any form of grief, or dealing with, whatever that is, all the emotions that go with the grieving and mourning process, you can feel very isolated. You can feel like no one really gets it. And of course, you're the only one that knows your experience. When it comes to complicated or complex, prolonged grief, they each have a slightly different meaning, but it encompasses a lot. And when you're talking about a relationship that was troubled during life, to give you a very quick story here. When I was working at a university, there was a young woman, a student assistant, who was working, supporting, our work. And she lost her father. And she said, I don't have to grieve. He was a terrible father. I don't care. He's gone. And she had this idea that because her relationship was troubled with her father, that she wouldn't have any grief. And then, time went by, about 6 months later, and she came in, she's just absolutely crying and devastated. And she said, how can I be grieving somebody that was just so awful to me? And I think what happens in those situations is, when you lose someone that you've had a troubled or difficult relationship with, the opportunity for that relationship to change, the opportunity to say things, or to hear someone say to you things that you really would like to hear, or that you would like to say, that's been taken away. I would say, if you are in prolonged grief is a difficult thing, because, actually my grief period of 2 years isn't all that unusual. It just wasn't fun. So there's certainly some controversy in the grief field about what does it really mean to have this. But I would say, especially when you've had a troubled relationship, it may help to talk with someone, to help you navigate if you're having trouble with that. I would also say, and this isn't crazy making, if there's a conversation that you always wanted to have with that person and never got to have, either you needed to tell them how you feel, or you needed them to tell you, you can actually have that conversation. You can do some visualization practices. I realize it's not the same as if they were physically there and you were having this conversation, but that's one way to process all that emotion, all that history, is to really have that conversation with them as if they were still here, or to imagine what you would like them to say and what that conversation would look like. And there's nothing crazy making about that. It's actually a really healthy approach. So that's one approach. There are others, and I would certainly encourage anyone that's struggling to reach out, see who in the community might be able to help you work through some of that.
Thank you, Kimberly. Boy, there is quite a lot. So the second one is, how do you discern between, I'm going to put two questions together. How do you discern between the pain of grief and depression? And for those without an emotional support system, how can one get past grief?
Certainly. The grief depression can be a really tricky little threshold. It's gray. It's not like there's a certain line. It's like, on this side I'm grief, and on this side I'm depression. Sometimes when grief does become more intense or prolonged, it can sort of morph into depression. You can also have a situation where, before you ever had a loss, you may have been dealing with depression. And so that will push the grief further into depression, or deepen that depression on top of grief, and they become kind of stacked. So sometimes you have to separate those out, and it's hard to tell. I think you have to listen to yourself. For me, at one point, again, after my mother's passing, and it'd been 2 years, and I had a physician saying, oh, you should try an antidepressant. It was just kind of listening to my own body, spirit, soul, intellect, that maybe if this continues, I'll consider that. But that just didn't feel like what it is. I just hadn't gotten over. And I actually had a very complicated relationship with my mother, and I'm sure that was part of it. Complicated relationships often do prolong and deepen grief. So it's a fine line. But I also think there are some people that, when the depression or the grief begins to look like depression, to the point that a lot of time is going by and you can't get off the couch, or the other thing, you become a workaholic and you're literally exhausting yourself every day trying to outrun what you're feeling, it may be time to talk with someone and see whether or not, a medication will help balance. You do get physical imbalances. Grief, we hold trauma and grief, not just emotionally, but in our head and in our bodies. And so sometimes, and again, the longer you grieve, suffering starts to become a way of life for you. And in those cases, you can actually change your biochemistry. Broken heart disease is a real thing. So in those cases, you do want to have some medical interventions because that may be what's going on. So, and then in terms of if you don't have a support system and you want one, not everybody does, but I find most people benefit. It may be helpful to seek out, most hospice programs have group support programs. There's a lot of online grief support that's out there, so you don't have to. I know I work with some people in very rural areas where there aren't a lot of resources for grief support. One of the reasons I, offer a group program is that includes both one-to-one and a group is to help bring people together to support each other while also getting some one-to-one support. But there should be resources right in your community, many of which, are free or low cost. But also go online because there are some major online. The one actual benefit of our pandemic experience is there's just a lot more available to us virtually. So I do encourage to get a partner, have a partner on that journey.
That's wonderful. And this goes into the next question, and I have 2 or 3 more. So hopefully we're going to get through as many as we can in the hour,
Right.
and really appreciate it. So you mentioned medical intervention. So the next question is, what is your opinion and or experience with the therapeutic benefits of psychedelics for those in the process of dying as well as their loved ones?
I personally have not experienced psychedelics. I haven't tried it. I have only worked with one client who on her own had some experience with, in a very carefully supported way with mushrooms. So I can't really speak directly to that because I personally haven't had that experience and I wasn't part of that intervention. I do know from what I've certainly read and from some of the training I sought around supporting people through grief and trauma myself to deepen my own skills and abilities to make sure that what I'm sharing is actually meets with what science and experience says. For certain people, it can actually be powerful, but for certain people who have that experience, it can transform their fear of death. It can transform people that were depressed before, often suddenly their head is above the clouds for the first time in years. There was a wonderful writer who passed away at the beginning of this year, and her name, of course, because I'm on a webinar with a few hundred people, her name is going out of my mind, but Compassion Choices posted about her passing in January. She actually tried that protocol and I think found it very, very helpful. And so, there are some other resources, but I can't directly speak to that. But I come with an open mind that there are many ways to get you moving forward and feeling better. And I would just say explore with caution and look for the research and the experience that's out there.
Thank you. I'm going to combine 2 questions to give you the opportunity to just answer them both. But the next questions revolve around how do you deal with sudden grief? And when loved ones have passed, how can I avoid the feeling of impending doom on myself?
Yeah. Tell me the first question again. I was listening to the second one and then the first one just kind of left like a little bird.
I said people are very, very articulate about their words. So the question, Kimberly, is how do you deal with sudden grief? That's the first one.
Okay.
And the second one is feeling the impending doom on myself.
Yeah. I'm going to start with the second question first. One of the things I wrote about in my book, and it's just so true, is that whenever you lose anyone, I say there's always at least 3 losses. There's the loss of that person or that beloved animal. There's the loss of the relationship because you're tied to each other and there's a relationship there that's now fundamentally different than it will ever be again. And then there's ourselves. We've lost part of ourselves. And when you lose somebody, and this is what the pandemic did on a massive scale, is remind us how absolutely fragile and vulnerable and finite our own lives are. And regardless of whatever we believe about the afterlife, the one thing we know for sure is right here and now. So it's actually really, really normal for a loss, a death, to bring up our own sense of our own impending death. I mean, you can actually grieve yourself. I mean, at times, I've had this at times where I'm laying at the end of the day and I can see my day as like another calendar day pulled off a calendar. And I think, whoa, someday I'm not going to exist. Somebody, I think I even wrote this in my book, somebody will be in this very room that I'm standing in and it won't be me. And they'll have their stuff in here. And it is a strange thought. But I also remind myself that for millennia, all kinds of things were happening on the world and I wasn't here. The whole world kind of carried on. So we have to find our own personal way of dealing with that. And certainly in this context of this conversation, I have all kinds of ideas about what that might look like. But to the extent that you can do this without really becoming overwhelmed, honestly, I found if you lean into that feeling and acknowledge that we are all going to cross through whatever that border is at some point, and to learn more about it, to learn from sudden death experiences, or I've just finished a program on shared death experiences and the special experiences some people have when they're with someone at the end of life, has given a lot of people comfort about when their time comes. In terms of sudden death, that can be really hard. Someone has said, what's worse, when you know someone's dying or when it's sudden? And I say, yes, they're both really hard. You have time to prepare if you know someone's terminally ill. Sudden death takes that away from you, and it can create a very deep grief very, very fast. And it may actually take you a little bit longer, right? Because you haven't, when someone is in the process, the earlier question about anticipatory grief, you haven't had that anticipatory. So, all of your grief is sort of on the other side and it's working through. The other challenge is what, the type of suddenness. If it's something where I work with families where people have their adult children were murdered and they don't know all the circumstances, they can feel tormented about what actually happened in those final moments. So a lot on how you work with that sudden grief is what you know about the loss. What is that story for you? Telling yourself the story, telling yourself your own loss story. So often we're so busy when people ask us telling our story, but we adapt it and adjust it because you don't want to upset other people, or you're too upset and you don't want to get upset in public. And sometimes we don't stop to really look at our own loss and our own story of loss as a healing mechanism for helping us kind of move into that, whatever's next in that process. So I would just say lean into that with curiosity. What is it about that? What am I feeling? Just literally ask yourself and try to be very specific. Don't just say I'm feeling sad. What kind of sadness? Try to put some words and language around how you're actually feeling that's a little more detailed, because sadness, it's sort of like the color spectrum, right? If you've ever tried to shop for white paint, there's like a million whites, right? And that's how emotion is. And so sometimes we start out thinking we're sad, and sometimes you can actually feel angry that someone died quickly. You can feel cheated. So spending time being curious is one step I would offer.
Thank you. And it's just really made me reflect, because about 13 years ago, my dad passed suddenly, and it was very transactional about what we had to do to get ready. And with my mom's passing now, it really went from a ventilator to special care to hospice. And it was a whole different experience, as you pointed out. It was really more about the experience of bringing her to that point. And one thing she gave me was my sister gave me her electronic picture frame. And I'm really also putting in place so many people that were in her life that have passed as well. So there's so many reflections that come into sudden grief and processing it that bring up different emotions. The next question, of course, because we are sponsored by Compassionate Choices, someone wants to know any ways to deal with family and friends who do not support the decision to use MAID.
Yeah, and I've encountered that in my own life. I've worked with clients who have utilized the protocol, and they've shared some of the challenges. Sometimes within families, you have family members that aren't all on the same page. And it can feel a little isolating, right? At a time when you'd like to have some support. Part of it is people don't understand it. That's just my, and again, I tend to always give people the benefit of the doubt that they simply don't understand it. Like so often people will talk about, it's euthanasia or it's a form of suicide. And so I use the opportunity to explain, no, most of the people that are accessing and utilizing medical aid and dying, if they were given their druthers, they'd like to be happy and healthy and, hiking and skiing and playing with their dog and loving their sweetheart. This isn't suicide. It's about when that pain gets beyond, right? So there's something we all know here. So I find it's helpful just to try to explain the nuances, the difference, why it's called medical aid in dying and not physician-assisted suicide, because first of all, the physicians aren't assisting you, so that's the other thing. But just helping people understand that there's a very important difference between suicide and the conditions that would lead one to feel that's their only option and choosing medical aid in dying. And then I also remind people that the more people who get the prescription don't ever use it, than the ones who do, right? So for many people, it is, to think if people can just put themselves, and I've even done a visualization, just imagine yourself with unrelenting pain, just total pain, and your whole quality of life is out the door. Is that really what you want? And for some, it's like, yeah, that's fine. That's your choice. But for some people, if there's something that, and you're going to be passing anyway, why do it with extra pain if there's something that can help you shorten that when you get to that point that you know what you can handle. So, there's many reasons. There's some obviously faith-based reasons that people choose. But so often I find is they just don't understand the difference between someone who may be dying by suicide versus someone who may be trying to request a medical aid and dying prescription.
Yeah, and Kimberly, it reminds me of when I came here and, having worked for, social service organizations, and I was like, well, we're not saving the planet, but someone said to me, I don't know what my choice would be, but everyone should have their own choice. And what you bring in that is it's just being respectful of autonomy, that, none of us can really understand what someone feels, but what we can do is chart the end of life journey that they want to have and be supportive. So I think your point about really explaining what it is and what it does is something we can do, and hopefully there'll be more awareness around it. The next question is one that I really reflect on a lot, but it says, how do we help guide bereaved through the why questions? Why did this happen? Why now? Why my loved one, etc.?
Oh, why is one of the biggest grief questions on the planet, isn't it? I think it's good to spend some time with the whys. Again, I'm big on leaning into curiosity, and I would even ask myself, why do I need to know? So, and everybody's why is a little different. I've worked with people who have lost loved ones to murder. Certainly, the why question comes up around people who have lost ones. I mean, after my friend Ruth took her own life. It just happened to be outside my kitchen window under a tree. I did not witness it, but I could never look out that window again and at that tree and not think of Ruth and what must have been going through her at a time. And I kept thinking, why? I just talked to her the day before. We had a bobcat show up and sit there in the rain, which was very unusual. And yeah, I sensed her down. And so you do all this. I could have, I should have. So part of it is sort of asking yourself, why are you asking the question? What is it that you really want to know? The bottom line is there is no answer to many whys. It just is. We are finite beings. Depending on your belief system, we, may be eternal beings, right? But in terms of this physical presence that you're looking at here on a Zoom screen, it's time limited. It has an expiration date. I'm not going to look for it. I don't want to know when it is. It'll come when it comes, right? So I think part of it is leaning in and trying to get past the question. If the question is, and in particular, if the question is, why did this happen to me? Is just to remind yourself, yes, it absolutely affected you. Acknowledge that it affected you. Acknowledge that not only a person, but a relationship and a role and a part of who you are is now missing as a result. But then realize that it really isn't done to you. It's just stuff happens. Life happens. I realize that's a really unhelpful answer, but it's only because I've spent so much time with those questions that some of them are unanswerable. Some of the time, though, I feel like the question I'm asking leads me to a question about myself and my future. And so by following those why questions, I realize, it helps you do some mindset. One of the grief pathways is we get caught in certain beliefs, like we can blame ourselves or think we had control. I've been working with a client on and off for the last year who just thinks it's her fault that her mother died. No, her mother was in hospice. Her mother had a terminal illness, and she could have done all kinds of other things she could not have stopped that disease process. But that's her mindset. So a big part of grief healing, and it's sort of what I call the fire pathway, is beginning to do a little belief system and really examining what is it that we believe about ourselves, about our loved ones, about death and dying, about the relationship, and then asking yourself, is it true? Is there another way of looking at this? Really testing it. Yeah. So I could go so far into that because this is big. This is a big grief pathway that holds people up. Is this sort of coming to terms, because that's ideology, that's thinking, that's your mind trying to make sense of something that ultimately is kind of senseless in terms of, who knows, why something happened. But it can lead you down to a path that takes you someplace better if you know how to go through that path.
That's really beautiful, Kimberly. As we're coming to the end here, I'm going to put out 2 more questions.
Great.
If we have time, I'm going to ask you for your final thoughts and to just take a minute to close at the end, if that's okay. So I hope you don't mind me trying to combine in the effort of time. But the first is, have you worked with people with progressive diseases like Parkinson's? Any recommendations on how to move through the layers of grief as the disease progresses? And then the second part of it is, a dying loved one can also experience grief. How can we best support them in their grief?
Okay, those are 2 great questions, and I can see why you combine them together. In terms of working with, I've never worked directly with a client with Parkinson's. Working in my philanthropy world, I've certainly worked with a number of people, and I currently have several friends and family members that are on that path of, and it's interesting with Parkinson's because for some it can be a fairly fast progression, for others not so fast, and there's so many different ways that it displays itself. I think in general, if I could generalize that question a little bit, I think whenever we are dealing with chronic health issues that change the quality of our life, that can affect us physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally. I have 4 autoimmune diseases. It's taken some mental processing to how do I, live well with this, right? So part of it is acknowledging that it's there. Sometimes people are told, oh, you're just feeling sorry for yourself, or you'll say to yourself, oh, I'm just feeling sorry for myself. Well, guess what? That's actually okay. Now, do you want to get stuck there and do that all the time? No. I always think of the book Tuesdays with Maury, and it's a practice that I use and encourage people to do. And I have a whole practice called the Moon River ritual that happened to me because I was grieving in an airport. That's a story for another day. But what Maury said, if someone asked him, because he had ALS, and he said, well, don't you ever get sad? And he goes, yeah, because he seems so upbeat, right? And he said, well, yeah, I do. But sometimes what I'll do is I'll cry. And then, 10 minutes will go by and I'll say, okay, I've done enough of that. Now I'm going to move on. So what I would say is, don't try to push it aside and pretend it's not there. I actually say create space to actively grieve, to actively acknowledge that you really do have something that's happening within you. That's part of who you are now. But then give yourself, and literally, I literally have done where I set a timer and then just said, okay, after I've had that cry, and there is some catharsis. That's a really short answer, but that's one quick strategy for doing that. I think I've lost the thread of the other question, Sam.
And there are more questions that perhaps I can send you in an email or something. Okay. The other one was just tying into a dying loved one can also grieve. How can we best support them in their grief?
Right. Well, again, I think you want to know the number one thing. There's lots out there on the internet about what to say and not to say to someone who's in the process of dying. So it depends on the person. The very thing that'll upset one person will comfort another. But what you can do is listen and not try to fix it. I think those of us that are I'm kind of an empathic person. And so it's taking me a long time to learn that I can't fix other people's pain. I can't fix the journey that they're on, but I can come alongside them on that journey. And I can just listen and just be a listening witness and essentially a presence. And so the number one thing is, again, giving people space and not feeling like you have to resolve it, not feeling like you need to say, okay. I know a lot of people at the end of life, people say, oh, you'll be here another 3 years. that's one that I find actually irritates a lot of people at end of life. And if they're in a lot of pain, you've just given them a pretty awful sentence for the next few years. And people mean so well. What I would say is don't not be there for people. When my mother was at the end of her life, a lot of friends disappeared because they couldn't handle emotionally seeing her decline, right? And that hurt my mother so bad. But if they had just simply shown up, just listened, just chatted, just watched something together. But invite people to talk about their grief, because a lot of times the dying, um, and the living too, frankly, don't want to burden other people, or they don't want the people that they love and care about to worry about them. But if you're sensing that there's grief that they're not expressing, just open that space. And it doesn't have to be, hey, you want to talk about your grief today? It really can be, how's this day going? What happened great today, or what hasn't gone so well? You can just open some real, not not yes and no questions, but questions that invite them to really answer and tell you something about their day or their experience. And then that you just sit back and you just listen and you just say, yeah, I hear you. That is tough.
And I'll
Yeah.
share, I'll include it. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No. That's
Um,
the best. Again, there are other strategies, but I think listening is the number one thing, and that's true for all human beings. There's a saying that all conversations are with ourselves, and sometimes they're with other people, right? And that sounds like a joke or a Zen koan or something, but it's kind of true. We're often in our own heads a lot, and in our own woes and worries. So just being able to kind of set aside whatever's going on with us long enough to be a full listening presence to someone else, that is an enormous gift.
I always joke, I call it having the conversation on our head with ourselves. And Marcia Streen, who you may recall, who after 5 years
I saw
medically
the
died,
story that she's left us. Yeah.
and she had a conversation with our CEO, Kim Callanan, about how to talk to dying people and just not make assumptions. So I'll try and share that as a resource.
Great
Um,
idea.
I want to say there are 29 questions and comments, so perhaps we
Okay.
can bring you back for another session. I want to thank everyone for joining us today and let
Thank
you know that
you.
we will be sending a recording and resources to all of you. And if I can get, we will have the chat. I will take those questions and see maybe Kimberly can give us some insight and perspective from it. I'd like to share Kimberly's information if we have a slide, or I'll put that in the email. And I'd like you to know that this is an ongoing series where I am here to help you for your connection, to be a relationship manager to compassion and choices. But we also have so many wonderful partners and interconnections to Kimberly. I encourage you to reach out to her if it makes sense. And also know that we have another session coming up at the end of the month with Rob Party on resilience, who is from his journey from a financial advisor to with his wife's experience to also doing life coaching. So thank you again. And we look forward to continuing our conversation. And I leave you with about 1 minute. Kimberly, would you like any last thoughts or
Um,
closing from you as well? And thank
I
you
just
again.
want to, yeah, I would just want to thank you and the invisible team that's off screen right now that's been supporting this webinar, everyone that's here, because there are a million places you could have spent the last hour, and I'm grateful that you spent it with us. So I just want to say thank you so much. I do want to just let you know that knowing that this program is coming up, and the fact that we are in the midst of several holidays and special events right now, I've made my book, Grieving Us, a field guide for living with loss without losing yourself. For the next 5 days, I've made the e-version of it, the Kindle e-version, completely free. So anyone that wants to go to Amazon and look for it, you can download a free copy. And my hope is that it would be supportive of you. I don't get any money or anything from it other than my purpose in writing the book was to be a supportive resource to people who are, trying to make sense of their grieving process and figure out how to live with joy again. Thank you
Uh,
so much.
you are selfless. We'll put that in the email as well. I apologize, the slide didn't come up, but we will share your contact information in the book. And I just wanted to let you know, I said that I thought we should have another session. I am told by my text that people are asking for another session with you. So we will work on that as well if you're amenable.
Okay.
And I wish everyone peace, and please connect with us so we can help all of us through this journey together. Thank you again.
Namaste, all. Love and light to everyone here, please.
Thank you. Goodbye, and we'll talk again.